Hi everyone, I'm Steve Levy with Ipsos in Canada, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to the third of a 10-part webinar program on the path forward. Our first webinar covered the Chinese experience, what happened, and how China is now opening up. Our second in the series was an Ask Me Anything program hosted by Darryl Bricker, who covered a multitude of issues about what the public in this country and abroad are saying, thinking, and doing. Now, both of these webinars have been posted to our website and are available to you. A few quick housekeeping matters before we start. First is that while you will remain on listen-only mode, you can submit questions by simply clicking on the question button. Your questions will be submitted privately to our team, and time permitting, we will answer them at the end. But if we do run out of time, we'll answer each of your questions by email. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and it will be posted at our website, and we'll send you a link to it in the next 48 hours, along with a post-webinar, very short, very brief survey evaluation, or rather webinar evaluation. The Path Forward webinar program is intended as a thought-sharing platform. And we're covering a bunch of different business issues that are or should be pertinent to your organizations and what you're facing today. Since early in March, we've been running a weekly COVID tracking study here in Canada and in fact in 13 different markets around the world. And I have to tell you that in my entire career, I have never seen behavioral and attitudinal change at the pace that we're seeing now. Not monthly, but weekly change. We've recently seen a decline in urgency and anxiety, and it's clear that the pandemic's broader impact is going to be economic rather than health-related, with now 75% of Canadians telling us that they think that their personal financial circumstance is going to be affected. In the most recent study, just last week, we see that Canadians really feel a mix of emotions when they think about life that is going to follow the pandemic. While uncertainty still prevails, we also see a sense of feeling fortunate and at the same time determined. Today, Asada Min, who leads the Food Service Monitor and 5 services at Ipsos, is going to talk to you a little bit about what he sees in terms of the changing landscape in food service. Asad, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My objective is really to help you get a firm understanding of the current state of the food service industry and really help you navigate through this uncertain period that we are all going through. Before I begin, I asked you to maybe indulge me for a few minutes. I wanted to describe to you what kind of a perfect day would look like if everything was normal, and maybe share with you a couple of my favorite spots that I like to go to eat. Now, these are all very biased towards the East End, which is where I live, but I'd argue these are probably some of the best spots in the city. A couple of West Enders would probably argue against that. But let me share with what my thoughts there are on these types of places. So I'd start off my day, get a flat white, a croissant, at a place called Mercury Espresso. The baristas know my name. They know how I like my coffee. I probably look at local paper and not think much about it. I probably spend the latter part of the morning going to a park with my daughter before we go to grab some lunch at a spot, which is a bit of a secret, called Tropical Joe's. It's a pretty big hole in the wall in a fairly low-key mall, but excellent Caribbean food. After that, maybe meet up with some of my friends at the local breweries that are in the East End, starting off with Abilene. And then eventually maybe I'll wander and stagger over to a bar called Port Romeo, which has some fantastic greasy burgers. Eventually maybe finish the night off, grab an ice cream on Ed's Real Scoop, sit outside on the Muskoka chairs, and pretty much watch everyone walk by. Now, the strange thing about sharing this with you, apart from the fact that it shows what a glutton I am, is that this would have been considered fairly normal in some ways, maybe a little overindulgent, but a month and a half ago. And the current landscape that we're in, I mean, this is near impossible. And this applies to not just these spots. We're talking about any type of restaurant, whether it's an independent or a chain. So a lot has changed over the course of the last 2 months. And the restaurant industry in particular has been impacted. We are able to measure incidence levels on a weekly basis, and we've been doing this for the last 6-7 years. And this tells us the percentage of Canadians that are likely to go out to eat yesterday. So historically, and you can see the trend line here from the beginning of this year, it usually hovers around 36 to 38%. But obviously, you can see subsequently, this has dropped off. With all the restrictions in place, closing of non-essential businesses, the inability for us to dine in, you can see that incidence level up to even last week has gone from an average of about 38% down to around 16%. And you can see the month of April in particular has been impacted. Now, the information that I want to use to try and help and provide some direction in terms of where we currently stand and potentially where we're going to go is gleaned primarily from our food service monitor. We're in field every day of the year. We've been around for 7 years. We've got a very robust sample size of 36,500 individuals. What we do is we track sales, traffic, and consumption behavior across the food service industry. And what we're trying to do is devise a series of reports using both our FSM as well as 5 services to give you a proper picture of what consumption looks like. We know from 5 that the ratio of 80-20 for in-home and out-of-home has moved to closer to 90-10. And that was March. I'm sure it's much more different now. And all the slew of different types of reports that we have related to the COVID tracker allows us to really understand how that behavior has changed. And with this we're going to try and assess what we need to do to action any type of immediate change related to this behavior. Now, for the month of March, we saw dollar declines overall in food service, down 47% compared to a year ago. Traffic was down 39%. Now, keep in mind this is for the full month of March. A lot of the changes took place around mid-month. If we look at the second part of March compared to a year ago, it's closer to 60%. And we expect April is going to be worse and hovering around that 60% or lower. We'll know in a couple of weeks. Now, if I was to quantify that number, for March, we're looking at a $2.6 billion decline in sales overall for the food service industry. And the number of people that went out to eat went down by around 440 million individuals. Now, the differences by different operator types are fairly evident, and it is as you would expect. Quick service restaurants declined by around 32%, while not as bad, obviously, as full service restaurants. It is pretty drastic. Full service restaurants, as you would have expected, went down around 67% in overall sales, and even the retail and other channels have been affected, and all declining at around 47%. Now, traffic is the lifeblood of our industry. To really understand the magnitude of the impact of the current crisis, one needs to understand the profit margins for the food service industry. We know profit margins for QSR on average is around 4.3%, and for full service restaurants, even less, at 3.8%. We're not just talking single digits, it's less than 5%. So if cash is king, which is what everyone's talking about, the ability for a lot of these restaurants, especially independents, to survive a couple of weeks, let alone a couple of months, is really difficult. We know 1 in 10 restaurants are already closing. There's several that have already closed in my neighborhood. So unless government subsidies kick in, unless there's more support, and of course traffic, there is potential for a lot more casualties down the road. Now, at the end of 2019, based on our data, we were already seeing a slowdown in overall sales and traffic. While it was still growing at the end of 2019, it has been softer than previous years. And what we saw in Q4 is consumer confidence had declined. It was the lowest in the last 36 months. So if you take into factor consumer confidence, which is eroding, higher debt levels, and higher menu prices, these have all been trending the food service industry on a negative trajectory. And with what we're seeing in the current environment, these things are likely to be expanded. But the key thing, of course, is to understand, well, how is consumer confidence going to move or change in coming months? To help that, a lot of people were looking at China's recovery once they came out of lockdown. Our first presentation in our series of webinars was from our managing director from our Ipsos office. And he indicated that the food service industry in China had resumed close to around 85% capacity. However, and unfortunately, they weren't seeing the same level of growth in traffic. People were just being a lot more cautious. And you can't blame them when they have been home for months. The psychological, physical, emotional toll is pretty high when they're thinking about their lives and thinking when they can return to a full level of normalcy. We're also looking at implementations for dine-in still being limited, and that you have to have at least 15 meters apart in a lot of places. Capacity levels have to be at least 50%. I think recently Texas even said capacity has to be around 25%. So there's still going to be limitations in place even when we return to what we would consider a normal. Now, curiously enough, I was just looking at various Google trends for restaurant. And if you look at the search term for Canada, you can see it obviously dropped off towards the end of March. Incidentally, it's pretty much in line with the incidence levels we were looking at. But I also looked at search terms in various East Asian countries, China, South Korea, Hong Kong, which have been indicative of being able to pass or flatten the curve. What you can see is there isn't that much of an uplift. It's definitely not resuming back to normal levels. So the main takeaway here is that the recovery process is definitely going to be slow. Now, as of today, and this only happened about 7 hours ago, New Zealand lifted their restrictions. And the biggest thing you can read on media right now is everyone's flocking and lining up to get their coffee and their fast food. These are actual images from, I believe, Auckland and Christchurch. And you can look at the number of traffic going around the block for what people are looking for. So there's obviously a pent-up demand, and it changes by culture and by country. The main thing to note is, well, how does this affect Canada? How can we indicate how consumers might be changing behavior down the road? So to help us give us some direction on that, we've developed the Consumer Optimism Scale. Now, what this does is it allows us to understand on one level how likely people are going to be more positive after the crisis ends versus those are going to be more cautious as well. So we see, as of the last 2 weeks of April, 48% of Canadians agreed that they're going to be more optimistic, i.e. once the crisis ends, I will enjoy life more than ever. However, we see there is a larger percentage that said they are going to be more cautious, around 58%. Once the crisis ends, I will be more cautious with my activities. Now, to really break this apart, what we've done is to look at the various polar extremes of these types of behaviors as well as the middle ground. So those that would be considered extremely optimistic, which would be around 18% of Canadians agree that they're going to fall into this realm. And then 28% still are going to be extremely cautious. So it still skews towards those that are going to be more cautious. Those that are going to be in the middle, i.e. cautiously optimistic. I will enjoy my life more than ever, and I will still be more cautious, around 30%. And that is the biggest piece out of these three splits. So I think the takeaway is that it's not all doom and gloom. There are still levels of society that want to return to a level of normalcy, but they're going to be careful. So it's a matter of how do you ensure that they are you mitigate a lot of their concerns. We're going to be using this as well as our weekly incidents to help us understand how this behavior changes and help our clients assess when they can start ramping up their operations to kind of reflect the current consumer sentiment. Now let's move to the present. With all the changes that we see in place, obviously the focus is going to be on off-premise dining, at least in the short term. Even when things return to normal, I think most people are going to be focusing on off-premise dining. As of February, before a lot of the crisis kicked off, the ratio between off-premise and on-premise was around 62% to 38% in terms of traffic. And over the course of the last 5 years, we are seeing traffic growing by around 9 percentage points to 62, and obviously on-premise declining. So the key thing to focus on, at least in the near term, is how do you address the differences and the changes that are happening in the off-premise dynamic, and how prepared are you to address where you fit in and where you play relative to where traffic is going currently. Now, if we were to look at how these channels break out, and I've split some of this information by the first half of March before a lot of the changes took place versus the second half. So even pre-crisis, we were seeing some shrinkage with dine-in, around 32%, but takeout was by far the biggest, 45%. 20% was through drive-through, and delivery was around 4%, and that's what it's been for a while. And this includes not just your third-party aggregators, your Skip the Dishes, Uber Eats, but as well as your traditional delivery services through pizza operators or various independents. So delivery as a whole has still been fairly small in terms of driving traffic overall. We jump into the second half of March, and the picture is very different. Takeout is still the biggest, 50%. 1 in 2 of every occasion in the second half of March was through takeout. Drive-through jumped to 1/3 of all traffic occasions. Delivery, albeit still small at 9%, doubled from that 4%. And dine-in obviously has shrunk. And as we go into April and coming months, dine-in is going to continue to shrink. And delivery and drive-through will be interesting to see how these things change. With delivery, I think the main thing to note is that there are definitely challenges and changes that are taking place. There have been challenges recently with a controversy with Uber Eats, with the outages they've had. Fedora decided to throw in the towel yesterday. As Steve alluded to, things are changing on a daily and weekly basis. And certainly some operators are going to benefit. Skip the Dishes, who we've been tracking, and we've been tracking at least 12 different aggregators for the last couple of years, have been leading, and I expect they're going to consolidate their position in this environment. Now, when we look at methods of ordering for off-premise in particular, for some time we've been seeing mobile ordering to grow. In fact, it was the largest means of ordering before everything took place. But again, when we see that split between the first and second half of March, it's pretty interesting because suddenly you see a surge in telephone orders, your traditional telephone orders. But let's put some context into the shift of mobile shrinking from 36 to 30%. What's really driving this is mainly pickup orders. So with Starbucks in particular, who led a lot of the pickup orders through mobile phones, closed a lot of their stores, the ones without drive-through at least. That is really what's driving a lot of that shrinkage. And what we saw was the share of delivery orders through mobile phones actually going up. Now, again, it'll be interesting to see how the landscape continues to change, but it's important to understand what's the best means of speaking to and talking to the larger community. Now, when we look at day part shifts, it's quite surprising. Now, remember, these are share differences. Overall, actual traffic volume has declined. But to my surprise, at least between the 1st and 2nd of March, I didn't see that much of a shift overall between day parts. Now, lunch obviously had eroded which is expected, and dinner has increased. I expect for the month of April that trend is going to be magnified, especially since the working from home program really kicked off, towards the end of March. But it's interesting to see that breakfast, in terms of share, held its own. And when you look at the growth in drive-thrus, which are primarily focused in the morning, it kind of validates and explains why the share shift wouldn't change that much. What's interesting to dig into is to understand, well, how is the type of items being ordered changed in the morning? Are people just ordering more coffees and not just going out for breakfast anymore? And those are some of the dynamics that I'd be interested to see in coming months as well. To really understand how do you best target off-premise occasion, you need to understand that needs drive behaviors. And, even before the crisis, we were all limited with our time levels. We had long commutes, busy lives. Now the commute's gone, but I would argue that there's lots of people that are busier than ever, especially those with kids. So a lot of the needs potentially might not change for these off-premise occasions. Obviously, convenience and portability remain strong. But I think some of the more emotional drivers are important to understand when you're considering your off-premise strategy. What's really important is to understand how these needs differ by the different channels that still exist. This is takeout, your delivery, as well as your drive-thru channels. So let's talk about takeout, which now, as I mentioned, is the largest share of occasions. The main things that differentiate takeout relative to the other off-premise occasions are still related to having cravings or a treat. People are still looking for that convenience factor, but what's interesting, what stands out is that people are looking to have a break. When you're being bombarded with so much negativity and uncertainty, there's a positive aspect of going out to eat and being able to have takeout. That is something to tap into and understand how you can kind of drive behavior based on those types of needs. Also, the functional aspect of not having enough groceries. Maybe it's the weekend and you don't want to go to the grocery store because you just want to avoid traffic, could lend you to maybe ordering delivery for that occasion as well. So something to be mindful of. So this image here for drive-thru is not from New Zealand. This is actually a Krispy Kreme location out in Mississauga, and it was taken a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure most of you have read about this. I'm actually guilty of lining up in the same way when they first opened the same location a long time ago. I'm not ashamed to admit that. But what this tells you is this behavior, even before we open up our restrictions, still exists. And what's fascinating is some of the dynamics behind drive-thru, which is, again, one of the areas that has grown, one of the areas that has certainly helped a lot of QSR operators that have this particular channel available to them. The functional aspects around portability still exist, but what's really more interesting is some of the emotional ones. Mental uplift, again, attributed to a lot of the habitual aspects of this behavior in this channel are still there. And as I mentioned, this channel skews more towards the morning, which skews more towards certain types of beverages like coffee. So a lot of the motivations driven by that need also skew towards this particular channel. What I found most interesting is the social aspects that are growing in this area and differentiated specifically, bonding with family and close friends. When we're stuck at home, we have limited ability to congregate outside. We can't have more than 5 people joining or kind of looping outside at the same time. This is something to be mindful of when families might go out and grab something to eat. And arguably they are being safe. I mean, they're in their cars and they are not exposing themselves to others. So it's definitely a channel to watch out for in the future. And finally, delivery. again, this is that opportunity, and one of those behaviors that we need to be watching out for. Is this going to be the new normal? And also, some of the challenges in the past have been on distribution, cost of entry. But I think what you're going to see is those that are going to be able to survive are going to stay. And there's definitely different needs that drive this particular channel. Interestingly enough, it's more the emotional ones that percolate up to the top. When people are ordering delivery relative to other off-premise occasions, and we're talking about March data here, they're looking for needs of relaxation, pleasure, stress relief. In this environment, those are things that are going to be pretty important for consumers. People are also looking for value offers. When you put into tips, delivery fees, obviously they're seeking value when they're looking at delivery. A lot of third-party aggregators offered free delivery over the course of, at least at the start of the crisis, but it's something to consider moving forward as well. And people are looking at customizing what they're looking for. You have the variety and you have the option as well. When we look at menu items, it's interesting that the ones that have grown in March are, again, the ones that skew towards drive-through in the morning. Bakery and desserts and beverages are growing. Interestingly enough, we have seen from Five, as well as a number of our custom trackers related to COVID, that baking is going gangbusters. And we know this anecdotally from all the news that we're hearing. But it doesn't seem to be affecting at least this consumption occasion because people are flocking to these types of channels. With beverages, there are differences between the hot and cold coffee in terms of what's growing and what's not. In terms of what's declining in terms of menu items, again, these are the ones that are more closely associated with full-service restaurants: entrees, sides, and appetizers. Salads are the one category that's been declining the most. Again, also skewed towards full-service restaurants. Also, it'd be interesting to know if it's related to any type of paranoia or stigma associated to the contamination of fresh foods at restaurants potentially. One entree that I will mention that's been growing is pizza. And this seems to be in line with what we're seeing across in the U.S. with pizza chains. And again, something we'll want to monitor moving forward as well. And finally, cannabis and alcohol consumption at home are up. 32% of consumers indicated they are consuming more of each of these types of items. Within FSM and Food Service Monitor, we know that actual food occasions sourced from food service with cannabis are up as well. Alcohol is actually down in March, but that's mainly because full-service restaurants, again, shutting down, and a lot of them are bars, are driving that change. But the takeaway here is that there is obviously an opportunity here when there's more consumers taking these types of, I guess, pleasures at home. So what is the path forward in the current food service landscape, both in the short term and maybe potentially in the long term as well? So we are, as I mentioned, we've been in place for the last 7 years. Based on our historic data and the trends that we see in March, we've looked at how the trends might forecast for the rest of 2020. Now, if anyone had a crystal ball, it would be quite amazing. If anyone tells you what's going to happen, that would also be quite amazing too. So what I've done here is given you kind of 3 scenarios based on how things might play out. This is the worst case scenario if we have an L curve. So we decline, we stay low for a long time until fall, and then maybe gradually things start picking up. Based on that, we would estimate a 44% contraction in sales overall for 2020. In scenario 2, which might be the more inevitable and likely scenario, based on what I understand, is that we might pick things up slowly around June once we lift lockdowns and gradually as well. Things might gradually pick up over summer, but if there are more infections, things might go down again, and we might have further lockdowns and restrictions in place. With this, we estimate overall dollar declines down by around 37% year over year. And finally, the best case scenario in terms of what we see, which would be a kind of a U-curve where we would see things pick up in summer, but it would be a gradual increase throughout the course of the rest of the year. So at best, we would see a 26% decline year over year in sales. So with this in mind, I think there is a level of caution you need to place in terms of how things will change. But there are definitely things you can start addressing right away if you haven't already. That would address the 5 points that I have here. Starting off with safety, I think all the motivations that I shared with you are all relative, but this is by far the most important thing to consider, and that's top of mind for everyone right now. The good news is that a lot of the marketing and communications the food service industry has started. A lot of chains have started. A lot of the independents have stated to their community, as well as third-party aggregators are showing that they are taking the right precautions, indicate that people are being more conducive to trying them out if they know things are more safe. So we saw that 62% of individuals agreed that restaurants are doing more to help prevent the spread of COVID-19, and that's up around 4 percentage points in the second half of April compared to the first half. The second thing that we're going to be trying to look for is that of value. We haven't seen much of a change yet, but this is based on March data. It's hovering around 24% when it comes to deals. Combos and coupons lead the way, but this is an area that we are going to continue to monitor. An interesting aspect that we are starting to see is the social dynamics of consuming together. With the inability of going out, we are seeing a lot of consumers, especially younger consumers, having virtual parties, whether it be watch parties or just hanging out and catching up. We actually see that there's 17% of individuals that are drinking with others during a video call or a streaming service. This is actually even higher for occasions when they're ordering takeout and delivery, and incidentally, at the same time, consuming alcohol or cannabis. So this is, although fairly small, this is up by around 8 percentage points from the beginning of April. It's an area that we'll continue to monitor, but it's something that you can address without the ability for us to congregate, and one of the emotional drivers for dining in is for the ability to socialize. Without that, this is definitely an area that you can optimize on. Of course, one has to think of other ways of driving traffic. And a lot of operators have already started to pivot and change their services. A lot of independents have moved to a more grocery service, independents and chains alike, especially in full-service restaurants. They're offering a lot of their products in the form of grocery. They are also offering a lot of coveted recipes for some of their favorite menu items. And consumers are being very, very receptive to a lot of this. What we're also seeing is that an area of the industry that we were seeing growing at probably the end of last year is that of ghost kitchens and virtual kitchens. And what these are is basically a hub where everybody, a number of different operators, primarily independents, can share a kitchen, and their primary purpose is for off-premise occasions, whether it's for takeout or delivery. This allows them to share costs, allows them to get through traffic that they wouldn't be able to before. And with the limitations that we see, the higher level of cost, the limitations of cash, it's definitely an area to be mindful of as we move forward. And finally, I'll place a note on the point on compassion. And really, the relationship we have with individuals and your visitors is in line with the relationship they have with you. It's a two-way street because you're as dependent on them, and consumers look to you for a lot of social occasions, a lot of memories, a lot of some of the best times they've had. So it's a matter of trying to capture that, and it sounds like a cliche, but we really do have to work together. The point I made earlier about a lot of restaurants offering their recipes and showing a level of gratitude. There are a lot of donations various chains are making and working together on different types of opportunities. And I would also encourage you, just in terms of driving traffic towards food service, if you're able to and if you're comfortable to, order food, whether through delivery or takeout. Tomorrow is National Takeout Day. It's the third week, I think, at least in Ontario. I've ordered twice already, and it's a good way to continue to drive traffic and keep revenues alive. The main point here is that unless we are going to work together, and we do this right now, the landscape is definitely going to change, at least in the near term. With the inevitably, things are going to open up at some point, but we don't know when. We know it's going to be slow. So whatever we can do to kind of encourage ordering food from restaurants, being open, and making sure that people are comfortable in doing so, that needs to be taken right away. So with that, I'll end my webinar, and I will hand things over to Steve.
Thank you, Asad. We do have time for a few questions, and we do in fact have a few questions. Perhaps just before we get to that, I would remind the 206 people who are still on the line that the trends that Asad talked to come from the 5 and FSM service that tracks consumption on a daily basis. So Asad, our friends and colleagues south of the border are starting to open up. We saw the Premier yesterday make mention of the fact that there's a staged plan to reopen, at least here in Ontario. How do you see things playing out once the restrictions are lifted in food service?
It's a good question. Well, you saw the 3 scenarios that I provided, but in terms of what's going to happen, it could go either way. On one end, you've got New Zealand, where they're chomping at the bit to have their coffee and their Mackies, which is what they call McDonald's apparently. And then you still have a level of caution in China and a lot of East Asian countries. I think it'll depend on how open and safe and prepared I think a lot of operators are. I think the other challenge that are facing, if a lot of restaurants are still going to be around, is that once they eventually do open up, they have had subsidies in place for a while. But when they open up, they are going to be limited with the support they've been provided. But they're not necessarily going to get the same level of traffic. At best, if they've dropped by 50%, it might be maybe 60. And that's still not enough for them to stay afloat. So I think it's a matter of understanding on both sides how you can kind of mitigate that difference. You really need to ensure that that takeout offering and the ability to provide that is there. Those that have drive-through definitely have an upper hand. But it's definitely interesting to see how things are going to play out.
So people, they're not eating out. Obviously, they're not eating out. What kind of things are you seeing people consume on the home front, given that they're not outside of the home? And as one person said, what kind of things are replacing out-of-home consumption?
Really good question. So far we haven't seen a drastic change in terms of overall category consumption. I think a lot of snacking occasions we had assumed were going to grow, and to some degree they are. What's interesting is what's happening on the morning front in home. people are home more than they've ever before. Everyone's working from home. So that's one day part that's completely changed the dynamic. When people are going to work, they're grabbing their coffee through their drive-through or on their commute in the subway, grabbing whatever they're going to eat. That's gone. So it's interesting because we're seeing a lot of kind of warmer, maybe indulgent breakfast items might take longer to prepare, grow. We're definitely seeing preparation times growing as well. So anything related to sausages, bacon, to some degree even eggs are up. What's interesting is that maybe the growth in coffee that I'm seeing, at least during drive-thrus in the morning, might be that trade-off between what people are doing at home versus restaurants. But I think over time it's going to be a matter of finding that balance. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of restaurants are offering meal kits as well. So as people are eventually going to get sick and tired of cooking, or just sick and tired in period of doing the same thing over and over again, that could still be an opportunity to try and cater to the inability for people to dine in, but still try and have freshly prepared foods. It would also mitigate them having to go to grocery stores as well, which is another factor that's a strength restaurants can use.
The question that a lot of people have asked in other categories, and it's clear that a lot of people are asking that today as well, is what kinds of things do you think are going to stick and be permanent, and what kind of things do you think are likely going to go back to the way that they were prior the pandemic?
So my cop-out to that is it's still early days, for sure. But it goes either way. My personal opinion is I don't think things are going to change completely. There's going to be some behavior. Then when people move back, are going to resume. I mean, if we go back to work, we're still going to be dealing with those commute times, taking our kids to school, dropping them off, and all the normalcies that we're going to have in life. So overall, long term, there might not be that much of a change. However, there could be elements where if we see delivery going and more people are now trying them out because they've never had the opportunity or wanted to before, now is the time to try and grow that behavior. If you use the adage, it takes 21 days to develop a habit, I think this is going to go on for a lot longer than 21 days. So I think some of those things are likely to stick. Same thing with online grocery shopping. We're definitely seeing growth there. So I think a lot of the, digital channels are where we're going to see a lot of changes. Another point is on contactless payments. We are seeing payments by cash declining. We've seen that for a while, and that's gone up considerably as well. The safety is one of the primary drivers, but I think it's just going to be a convenient, fat way to pay in the future as well. So a lot of those things I think we're going to see change for sure.
Well, our time is just about up. Thank you, Asad, for joining us today. I can tell you that I am very much looking forward to a big hamburger and fries at Holy Chuck's at the corner of Yonge and St. Clair. Our next webinar is on May 6th at 1:30 when Becky Harris is going to be talking about the new front line. Now, during this session, Becky's going to discuss how organizations have already started to measure remote channels and draw on the lessons that have helped improve customer service with that new front line. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and we very much look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve.